How many hours and years of our lives do we spend on work? For nearly all of us, we spend 30 plus years and 1/3 of our days in our vocation. More time perhaps than we spend at rest or at play. But this isn't a problem. Why? Because work is good. Work needs to be integrated deeply into our lives and must be in line with our most important goals and values. And if it is, we have a far more complete and fulfilling life experience. Welcome to the How People Work podcast, where we explore the intersection of how humans think and act and how they apply themselves to their work. When you understand both of these things, you'll be equipped to be insightful, compassionate, and compelling leaders. Welcome back to How People Work. This is your co-host, Jordan Peace.
Back with us.
Back. The real Jordan Peace hashtag. I should have that.
I guess so.
Yeah, that'd be kind of fun. What's the thing called on Twitter? Handle. I should have that Twitter. The real Jordan Peace. Somebody probably already does. Sitting here with Jason Murray as usual. Jason has not left you for 2 weeks like I did. I apologize, but I am back. Excited to pick up where we left off, and thank you to Cassandra Rose for filling in for me. She did a fantastic job and made the job look a lot better than I do, which is always appreciated for those that see our video clip. But yeah, you guys talked a lot about well-being, a lot about, I was just listening to this clip around, she's talking about how you can kind of do everything right, but if you have poor managers, then it all falls apart, which is a very frustrating thing to hear, because you're like, wait, you're saying if we do everything else right, but this one thing. But at the same time, I think in a strong culture with happy people where well-being reigns, you wouldn't end up having an ugly experience with your manager, because your manager would be healthy themselves, right? They would be well. They would therefore be kind and have reciprocal relationships with their peers and employees and friends, et cetera. So we want to talk a little bit more today, and I'll let you frame it up, Jason, since I've been gone a little bit, but about where this topic of well-being has not come into play as if it wasn't before, but really resurfaced in a very strong way recently, and kind of what that's about, what's going on in society that would lead to that, what's going on from a research standpoint that would lead to this resurgence. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, having that positive vision of work and that positive vision of life, right? And having something to anchor on, and all about how that plays in to well-being. But how did it go with Cassandra? Was it nice to be rid of me for a couple of weeks?
Oh, it's great having you. Yeah, but Cassandra's awesome. It was great chatting with her about.
Did you give her a word of the day that she had?
I did not. Okay. I didn't do that to her.
You were kind.
Yeah,
you were kind.
I was a little afraid of what she would have done to me if I tried to give her that.
It is a distracting thing sometimes. You're sitting there the whole episode going, when am I going to squeeze this word in there? But.
And she's like very professional in the best of ways. And I'm so casual. I felt a little intimidated, honestly. So I was like, I'm not going to do that
Mom
to her.
Came to the podcast and made you behave.
Yep. So we got into well-being a little bit. We touched on, in one of the episodes that we did on this Deloitte workforce well-being imperative, which is a report that they put out recently that I actually want to dig back into a little bit, because we kind of scratched the surface, but we didn't really dive into it. But this question of why well-being is surfacing more as a conversation, I think there's a whole bunch of factors going into this, and I'm interested in your thoughts on it too. But I think one of them is this sort of historical perspective of, well, there used to be wellness. That was kind of the way people talked about it. And wellness originated as a way to manage population health within organizations. So it was first and foremost, an effort to try and improve health to reduce claims costs. And so it was purely driven by cost savings within the organization. So we might infer maybe there were some good intents that, if people were healthier, they lived better lives, blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, your medical plan is one of the biggest costs that you have outside of payroll for an organization. So if you could reduce that cost, hey, that probably sounds pretty good. And so this effort kind of originated decades ago. And over time, the evidence for sort of improved outcomes around wellness in that way are suspect, to say the least. And so that began to kind of shift into more of this engagement. Well, let's measure engagement. Maybe that's a better way to look at this. Well, what happened most recently is the pandemic, right? And so all this time we've been thinking probably since, early 2000s that engagement is the thing, right? We need to measure employee engagement and improve employee engagement. And there's aspects to that to unpack more than likely. But what happened is the assumption was always made that engagement was a good proxy for well-being. And so if engagement looked good or if it was trending in the right direction, that was a signal that, hey, your people are in a pretty good place, right? Well, what happened in the pandemic was all of a sudden you got this divergence between engagement and well-being. And so what happened was everyone was working at home. As you know, they were actually far more engaged in their work than they ever were before. Because of technology, because of proximity, right? You're not leaving an office any longer. It's just there all the time. And so engagement rates actually went up early in the pandemic. But what plummeted, captive audience, all sorts of reasons. But kind of measures of health and well-being tanked. So stress levels through the roof, right? Like, we're all at home with our kids. If you have kids, like, what do you do? It's like pretty stressful.
Totally.
And so,
because you can be engaged from a standpoint of you respond to emails quickly.
Exactly.
Or you attend meetings or you show up on time. If those are the measuring sticks of engagement, then you can program people. You could program apes, to be engaged, from that measuring stick standpoint. But from a relational engagement standpoint, like that actually was a huge challenge early in the pandemic. To feel really connected at all.
Well, and what it revealed is engagement doesn't tell the full story. So engagement, we're not suggesting engagement is a bad metric to use, but it's certainly not the only metric we should use.
Sure. I could think of times in my own personal life where I was probably hyper engaged at work, specifically because I was not doing well personally. Whether I was insanely stressed about something going on, a health thing happening in my family, or marital stress, or whatever the case may be.
Work's a distraction.
Sorry, honey, we do fight, but everything's good. Work's a distraction. Work's a place to hide sometimes, from the things going on in life. So the thought that engagement would just sort of like cover you in terms of measuring wellness, or well-being when you take a step back and think about your own life, it's like, that's kind of ridiculous.
Well, it seems self-evident when you step back and think about it in that way. But I guess nobody really stopped to think about it in that way. And so what the pandemic did is it elevated this awareness of, like the way we've been thinking about this and, running engagement surveys and seeing improvements and then just kind of checking that box like, hey, everything's good. All of a sudden we realized, well, that's not adequate to what's actually going on. People are more complex than that. The relationship between engagement and actual health, stress, well-being is much more complex than maybe presumed.
I think part of the problem is employers are trying to benefit employers, as a primary, And I think that if you focus on benefiting your employees as a primary means, the benefit will come back around to the employer as a secondary means, So if you were to say, okay, well, let's measure engagement and let's call it a proxy for well-being. And so as long as people are logging in, attending meetings, responding to emails, doing all of the work things that benefit the employer, then we're just going to check that well-being box because it's good enough to get the work done. But of course, what's happening is this slow drift, There's this slow, kind of slow work death, if you will, of just like, I'm here, but I hate you. I responded to that email, but with a lot of cynicism, And over the course of time, if the well-being itself is not prioritized, then all the engagement in the world is not going to mean a whole lot, Whereas I think if you focus on the actual well-being, the health, the happiness, the purposefulness of your employees, you're gonna, as a side effect, you're gonna get all the engagement you want, I think it's just a focus on the wrong thing, and that all goes back to this population health idea of like in the very beginning, why were we measuring wellness to begin with? To save claims costs.
Right.
Right. It was all kind of directly about the employer's
first
benefit.
and foremost bottom line driven versus
driven.
what
Right.
you were saying is,
Yes.
well, hey, can we start with a different end in mind?
Yes.
And maybe that end is, as we've suggested on this podcast, human flourishing.
That's right.
Versus
The bottom line boon will follow. Absolutely.
Right.
How could it not?
100%.
How could it not?
Yeah. Well, and I think it's worth talking about because I think you said a couple things when you were describing well-being that would probably be easy to gloss over. And I suspect people might be like nodding their heads saying, yeah, I totally agree. But there's some nuance that's worth unpacking because I think my experience in talking with many hundreds of HR leaders in the time that we've been operating Fringe, maybe more, maybe thousands.
No exaggeration there.
No exaggeration. Is that I can't say that I've come across a consistent, maybe consensus viewpoint on what exactly is meant when we talk about well-being. And so what I observe is there's still a lot of conventional thinking around well-being in that it hasn't moved far from what wellness was thought of originally, which is really narrowly focused on, mental health, physical health, and financial health.
Right.
And so it was really just tied to what I've got a health plan.
Yep.
I've got a retirement plan and I've got an EAP plan that gives me a couple counseling sessions as needed, right? Boom, check those boxes. Yes. We got well-being covered. And what you described, I think, was something where you included words like purpose in it. And I don't think you said holistic, but that's what I was thinking in my mind was like a viewpoint that was more all-encompassing than just those three kind of silos that I think are typically referred to. Yeah,
it's funny. When we sit down to start a business, we immediately go, okay, what's the mission? What's the vision? And what are the values? Because it's some trained business school thing, right? And a very good thing, I think, that we do as a company. But how many people at 15, 16 years old or 18 or 22 or whatever sit down and do the same thing for their life? Like nearly no one. Unless you've got some incredible kind of mentors and maybe a counselor or somebody in your life that's incredibly wise that sits down and goes, what's your mission statement? Right? What are your values as you could actually write them down and speak them out loud and kind of speak them into existence? You're not doing that, right? So you jump into a company and you're inspired, potentially, hopefully, right? You're inspired by this idea of, oh man, this company has a mission and I'm on the mission too, right? But it's not deep enough. It's not good enough to sustain an individual for years and years and years to have a shared mission with a group of people that is about ultimately maybe at best, some social change, some world change, some aid of other human beings in some way, and it's good. But it's not that individual's vision. It's not, they didn't sit down and create it. They're just jumping in. Right. And that is a degree of purpose that is more than nothing. And that's great, right? But if you don't have that in your life, then your life is like, you're like, I'm trying to think of something lightweight, like a feather or something, right? The wind blows and you're just flying around, right? The wind of circumstances, right? Oh, I got a raise and people were nice to me and they complimented my shoes today. And like stuff went well and I had this new tequila that's really good, right? Like I'm happy.
It's a feeling.
It's a feeling.
Right.
But it happened to you.
But it's not sustained.
It's not sustained because when the opposite things happen, when you feel you didn't really dig in your outfit that day and your boss was a jerk, or maybe not even a jerk, they just weren't overwhelmingly kind, or whatever the situation may be, and now we're down and out. And if those things happen, those circumstances that are negative happen over and over again in sequence in a certain context, whether that's work or whether that's in a relationship or whatever the case may be, our tendency is just to run away from the circumstances in which we experience the negative emotions. Yeah. Right? Because we're not anchored to anything that's greater or higher than the emotion of the moment. To go like, well, yeah, you know what? I really didn't enjoy the last 2 weeks at, I don't know, of college as I'm studying to get my doctorate in X, Y, and Z, right? So I'm just going to quit. Versus, no, I've got a vision for this thing that I'm going towards. Like I can suffer through 2 weeks. Like, damn it, I'm gonna do it.
Yeah,
I want to work hard, right? And so I think that's what I mean when I talk about purpose and like when we talk about happiness. And I wrote a blog I don't think we've published yet, but about like degrees of happiness. And like there are a lot of meanings to that word as you look back through the Latin or the Greek or however far back you want to go.
Yeah.
Right. There's levels of that, and none of those levels are sustainable until you get to that place where there's purpose in life. Right. Yeah. All of it is just sort of that. Yeah,
we talked about that a few episodes ago. Yeah, where there's those different kind of levels of happiness. Like in the Greek.
Was it Aristotle? I can't remember who exactly
it was.
Yeah.
I think it's an important point. So one thing I think is I hadn't actually seen this until a couple weeks ago, but the World Health Organization actually uses a definition of well-being that's very much aligned with the way that we've been talking about it, which was surprising. I didn't expect to come across that, but they actually...
You think it's something purely medical in nature.
Well, and here's the fascinating thing. There's kind of a couple layers to it, but one is they name employment as a critical social determinant of health. So they have all these kind of determinants of health, or what they call social determinants of health, that are kind of factors that play into what likely determines health outcomes for an individual or community.
Right.
And so employment is one they name explicitly. So your degree of employment or unemployment, obviously, but then also the content of the work that you're doing has a really profound impact on well-being in the case of physical, mental, social, financial, et cetera. But they also name your sense of purpose and ability to grow in that definition of well-being. And I think it's awesome. And I mean, I'm just curious your reaction to that description.
Yeah, I'm a little shocked about the source of that. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty amazing that an organization that, you know, I just would really expect something kind of very clinical, very medical, you know? So that's pretty neat, actually, to think about someone's thinking more deeply about it. And obviously there's a lot of data to suggest that it's not, you could have perfect health and you could eat all the right foods and you could, you know, all of that sort of, even work out nonstop and get maybe the endorphins and everything from that. And that's great. But even that is just that like level one kind of happiness, level one. So I think that's great. Yeah. When I think about like what's going on in our society that leads us to this place where well-being is more of a conversation, I think COVID is part of it, right? You've got a mental health crisis. You've got a lot of people focused on mental health. The focus on that expands the definition of health a little further.
I think it just brought it to the forefront. It's not that people didn't have these issues before, but we're talking about it.
Right? Yeah, it got more attention. But I think too, just kind of culturally in the West, at least, like we've kind of made up our minds, for right or wrong, and I'm going to argue wrong, right? That whatever we feel is kind of the truth and paramount and most important. And as we just described around circumstances, feelings they change like the weather.
Yeah.
You know, if more often than the weather, right?
Yes.
And so I think we've come to a wrong conclusion in Western society that we can trust our feelings to kind of guide us, guide our decisions, guide how we see the world, interpret the world, teach others about the world. Yeah. So I think that's problematic. And then I think also the polarization kind of politically and socially that we've seen over the past 10 years has also been really harmful, because I think there's so much anxiety induced by the idea that I might say the wrong thing, or I might say the wrong thing to the wrong person, or I might kind of trigger somebody through something that I'm just kind of trying to share where I'm at, my worldview.
We're losing our social moorings in all this. I mean, we've kind of gone to such an individualized, like the degree to which we interpret our experience of the world through an individualistic lens is so great that it's just my happiness is paramount. And happiness, not in the way that we've been talking about it, in terms of a sense of fulfillment and purpose that involves, you know, local community, your family, and so on and so forth. It's literally just, how do I feel right now?
Right.
But I think when we step back, it just doesn't even make sense.
Yeah.
So when I was driving over here,
That's funny.
coming to record this with you, I was listening to a podcast, and these folks were talking about well-being. I was kind of curious to see like what they were talking about. And one of the people in the podcast referenced a statistic that said, well, 44% of people, when you poll them, say they experienced stress at work the previous day. And 22% of people say they experienced sadness or anger.
Yeah.
And so they were using that to kind of support this sort of sense of like, yeah, there's a huge problem. Like, people feel a certain way, and like those feelings really need to acknowledge them, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, that's true.
Right.
We do need to acknowledge what we feel. But when I look at my own experience, and you alluded to this earlier, it's like, sometimes I'm doing things that I love at work and insanely stressed at the same time.
Right.
Both things are true.
Right.
And so how do you hold that together?
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
you can't live under a constant state of stress.
Yeah.
But in some respects, like, what do you do with the fact that a lot of people don't have any control over their circumstances?
Yeah.
Or a lot of us have kids that can stress us out of our minds at time. What are you supposed to do?
I
with
mean,
that?
100% of us have no control over at least some of our circumstances, right? Like getting a disease, right? There are things that like, it doesn't matter what you do in life, like you don't have control over everything.
Yeah. And so, well, this thought just popped into my head is, so we often think in terms of what improves our situation is the absence of the thing that we don't like.
Yeah.
And so I think the default sort of position that people come to is, oh, stress makes me feel bad. And so therefore the optimal position is get rid of stress. Right. But when you think about these definitions of purpose and happiness, none of them are about the absence of something. They're actually about the presence of something better.
Something better.
Right?
Something more pure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so
I saw an Instagram video, and this is about raising children, you know, but the point stands. This guy had a glass of water, and the water had like leaves and grass and like all this like stuff in it, and you wouldn't necessarily want to drink it. And so, you know, basically what he was showing was, hey, I can sit here with a spoon or tweezers and I can try to pull like all the dirt out of this water, or I could just take a glass of clean water and pour it right over the top, and all the crap just comes out of the top, right? And I've got this crisp cup of water. And he was using that as an analogy to say, hey, just love your kids, because the love poured in is actually what's gonna kind of get the impurity out, right? Which is a beautiful concept. But here it's the same thing. It's this idea of like, yeah, you can sit there and go, man, another leaf, another piece of grass, you know, like, and just with tweezers your whole life, just trying to pick the unpleasant things out, right? Or you can pour in purpose. Yeah. Right. You can pour in the thing that you actually want into your life, right? You won't even notice the impurities. Yeah. You know, by comparison at least. Right? Yeah.
I remember one of the first conversations I had with my counselor when I went, and they were talking, and they asked me like, hey, what are you trying to accomplish here? And I was like, I have no idea. I don't know what I'm here for.
They told me I was supposed to show up. Yeah. Some bad stuff happened.
Yeah, some stuff going on in my life. And like, I don't know. I think I'm just supposed to do this.
I hate that initial question. I'm like, I don't know.
So, you know, there's all kinds of good stuff in like ancient kind of wisdom traditions. And so in the Jewish tradition in particular, there's a word called shalom that, you know, we often translate as peace, but in the Hebrew language, it actually has a much deeper and richer meaning. And one of the things that came out of my counselor asking me about this was the fact that shalom actually represents a view of well-being, let's say, that's actually very aligned with the way the World Health Organization described it. So that was one of the things that was shocking to me. And then the other thing that's really interesting about it is the word shalom in the Hebrew tradition actually isn't about the absence of anything either. It's about the presence of fullness of life, fullness of health, fullness of purpose. It's basically fullness of fill in the blank.
Wow.
And so I think that's really relevant because I think about, you know, maybe a like single working mom, and like the only job that she can get is this like kind of shitty job. And like, what else is she, like, probably she hates it.
Yeah.
Probably it's super stressful.
Right.
And so is well-being for that person supposed to be like, oh, you're just in a dead-end job. You got to get out of it. Like what
Right. Change your circumstances.
Right.
Now, go.
Or
right.
is there a better
Right.
and deeper way that like everyone has the opportunity to experience well-being?
Clearly there is, because for studies time out of mind have all come back and shown that the happiest people on earth are the people just above the poverty line. So it is not about getting the best job, making the most money, and having the most whatever freedom over your time, possessions, et cetera, that clearly there's something else, right, that people can be plenty happy, right, in a situation that maybe you would from the outside in say, well, that's not an enviable.
Those aren't circumstances that I would willingly take on. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I think there's a lot of reasons why this conversation is more and more relevant than ever. And I think what I'm proud of about, because I said some negative things about our society, but what I'm proud of about our society is I think the courage that's come in our generation and the one that follows us to actually take a look at the deeper things, at the more emotional things, to kind of look at kind of work and life integrated and go, how do we we're asking the right questions finally, as opposed to this tough guy, hey, just stuff it and work. Right. Like that's not sustainable, right? And we don't want a pendulum swing to the other side either, where it's like, well, our employer is now our parent, and their responsibility is to kind of coddle us and make everything in our life okay. Like that's not it either. But I think good management, good training is taking that mission, vision, and values kind of business school thing and turn it and democratizing that into, hey, employee, let's figure this out for you. Like that's what training should look like initially. Let's help people be like fully integrated adults. Right. And then, we'll see what kind of stresses they can handle at work, what kind of leadership they can take on, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Right. But no skill set in the world plus a bunch of kind of grit and determination is going to get you all the way where you want to be if you have no idea where you want to be. Right, exactly. It's not going to just happen to you. And if it did happen to you, if somehow you willed yourself into someone else's definition of success, you're just going to get there and be miserable because you never wanted it in the first place, and you still don't know who you are or what you want. Right. So it's just such a core thing and such an important thing, I think, for employers to focus on. And to not be scared of that, and to not go, well, that's none of my business. That's too personal. This is work. You can't manage that way. You just can't. You have to get into the heart of the matter, into the heart of people, and really reach them. Otherwise, they're just going to keep bouncing around and looking for somebody who will. Who will engage fully.
And there's a topic there that I think is going to be exciting to talk about in our next episode, because some things that you just pointed out, I think, are referenced in this article that I want us to discuss. And one of them is, well, what's the responsibility of the individual and the employer as it relates to well-being? Because traditionally it's like, that's your thing. Right. You just do what you need to do to be well. Right. And I think what the acknowledgement is, well, if we're going to say work and life are together, integrated, they're not separate, then there's a more complex relationship that involves both the responsibility of the individual and the employer in that relationship.
I realize I failed fully. Let me go back to my analogy where I was describing water, and purified water and immaculate water was right there. It was right there and available to me, and I missed it.
I was going to call you out on it, but I've gotten burned on that before, and I was like, he probably slipped it in somewhere.
Did miss it, and I'm shocked that we've been going something 26, 27 minutes already. So,
and Jordan, your word of the day for the next episode is going to be auspicious.
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 All right. How opportune. So So tee up the next episode for us, so that way we can just kind of march right into it. So we're going to go from here, which we covered maybe one or two questions that we had planned to discuss out of like 10.
So we're going to stay on this topic of well-being, but we're going to reference this Deloitte Workforce Wellbeing Imperative specifically, which we'll make sure we include in the show notes. And we'll probably unpack this over the next 2 episodes because there's a lot of content here, and I think it's stuff that's really interesting and exciting. But I know the way that we get going on these things that we're not going to do it all in one episode. So the plan is over the next 2 episodes, we'll continue this thread of well-being and unpack some of the things that I think we agree with, maybe some things that we don't agree with or have some critiques on in this article.
Great. Well, it seems to be our style to plan, like I said, 6, 7, 8 questions that we're going to discuss and discuss exactly one, maybe 2. So in that light, if you're listening, you've been listening for a little while, you kind of understand the gist of the things we like to talk about from a philosophical standpoint and from a work and employment standpoint. Please do submit a question. I would love if that was our world where we just got on and looked and said, oh, here, that's a perfect question. Let's do an entire episode about that. So would love to do that. Thank you all for listening to How People Work. We will catch you next week and looking forward to talking to you again soon, Jason. Thanks.